The cab moves through gaslit streets. That is the image to hold. A hansom pulling through the winter dark of a Tuesday evening in February 1889. The horse's breath rising in pale clouds against the cold, the iron wheels ringing on wet stone. Inside, a man sits with his head beginning to droop. Outside, the city carries on. The shouts from a market stall, the distant brass of a pub piano, the smell of coal smoke and river damp that settles over Manchester on nights like this, like a second atmosphere. The cab moves, the man inside grows still, and somewhere in the darkness, a young man is already running. I'm your host Susan, and this is Manchester Murders, Episode 13, The Manchester Cab Mystery. John Fletcher was 50 years old in February 1889, and he wore his prosperity with the comfortable ease of a man who had earned it slowly and kept it quietly. He was the senior partner in a firm of paper manufacturers whose offices sat in the city centre on New Brown Street, and although he'd recently stepped back from the day-to-day management of the business, leaving that to his nephew, he remained a figure of standing in commercial Manchester. He was well known at the Exchange. He sat as a Justice of the Peace. He had recently been elected to Lancashire County Council. These were not the achievements of a reckless man. He was a widower. He kept a house in Southport, the genteel seaside town on the Lancashire coast, where retired merchants of his type went to take the air and manage their affairs at a remove from the noise of the city. His habits were those of his class and his era. He visited his offices, he attended to his investments, he ate at the right establishments. He was also, it must be said, a habitual gin drinker. Those who knew him well knew this. It was not a secret, and it was not, by the standards of the time, particularly remarkable. Half the men who drank at Manchester's commercial hotels drank as much. But it was a fact about John Fletcher that would come to matter a great deal before the month was out. On Tuesday the 26th of February, he had packed a case for a weekend stay in Knutsford and left Southport on the morning train. His plan was to stop in Manchester for the day, visit the company offices, attend a mill auction at the Mitre Hotel near the cathedral in the afternoon, and then continue on. He'd arranged to meet a colleague that evening at Sunderland's, a popular shellfish restaurant in Victoria Market. It was the sort of plan a man makes without thinking about it, the routine framework of a busy but unhurried life. At the Mitre Hotel, several friends and colleagues saw him that afternoon. They would later testify that he had been, in their words, somewhat under the influence of drink, although they were careful to add that he was in full possession of his faculties. He was not a man who lost himself. He was a man who drank, and there is a difference, and they understood it. He made his appointment for that evening, and he stepped out into the late afternoon of the city. He never reached the restaurant. Manchester in February 1889 was a city still absorbing the shocks of its own growth. The cotton trade had made it and was beginning to unmake it by degrees, but the mills still ran, the warehouses still filled, and the Exchange still bristled every Tuesday with merchants and brokers and the complex social machinery of Victorian commerce. The streets around the cathedral and Deansgate were a particular kind of overlap, old ecclesiastical stone giving way to gin palaces and market stalls, hansom cabs threading between costermongers' barrows and the evening foot traffic of clerks heading for their tea. The gas lamps came on early in February. By 6 o'clock, the streets were already their own world, half respectable, half not, the distinction depending largely on which door you pushed open. It was into this world that John Fletcher walked after the mill auction, and it was in this world that he encountered the young man. We do not know precisely when or where they met. What we do know is that by the time a police constable spotted Fletcher at a market stall, some time after 6, the two men were already together, the respectable paper merchant in his good coat, and his companion, a young man of about 22, 5'2" tall, clean-shaven with a fresh complexion, wearing a dark brown suit and a chimney-pot hat. P.C. William Jakeman noted the detail of Fletcher's own clothes, which he described as slightly disarrayed, a small observation that would later carry more weight than it seemed. At 6:30, the two men climbed the steps of Manchester Cathedral and hailed a cab. The cabman was Henry Goulding. He would remember this fare well enough. He drove the two men south to Deansgate, to a public house called the Three Arrows, where he waited outside for 20 minutes while the two men went in for a drink. They each had 2 glasses of bitter. Fletcher paid. The landlady of the Three Arrows would later recall speaking to the deceased, in the company of a young man, at about 7:15. She could not give a description of either of them. She could not say whether Fletcher had been wearing a gold watch. She could not add much at all, except to confirm that they had been there, and that the young man had drunk his glass quickly. Just after 7, they came out and climbed back into the cab. Goulding was instructed to drive towards Old Trafford, to a private address on Stretford Road. The city streets were busy, and en route they ran into something unusual. A street procession, advertising Mexican Joe's Wild West show, which was newly opening on Oxford Road. The crowd had spilled across the thoroughfare, bringing traffic to a halt. Goulding climbed down from his box to walk the horse through. As they moved on, a passer-by on Cambridge Street called up to him. Words were simple and direct. "A young fellow has just jumped out of your cab and run down Cambridge Street." Goulding stepped down again. The near side door of the hansom was open. Inside, John Fletcher was slumped against the seat, his head resting on the cushion in front of him, his eyes half closed. His companion had gone. The cabman lifted Fletcher's head and rubbed his ears, trying to rouse him. Fletcher muttered something, "Go away and leave me alone," and Goulding, uncertain what else to do, shut the door, climbed back to his seat, and drove back towards the city centre. At around 7:45 he arrived back at the cathedral steps. He found a police constable there and explained what had happened. The officer suggested that he drive his drunken passenger to Albert Street Police Station, but by now Fletcher was unconscious, and Goulding made the decision to drive instead to the Manchester Royal Infirmary. The house surgeon on duty that night was Mr. John Hampden Barker. He examined the man brought in from the cab, and at 20 minutes to 8, on the evening of Tuesday the 26th of February 1889, he certified John Fletcher dead. The following morning Manchester woke to the news. It spread quickly, the way bad news does in a city that is already nervous. The Jack the Ripper murders in Whitechapel had concluded only months before, or rather had stopped without anyone being brought to justice, which was worse in its way than a conclusion, and the general public was not in a mood to feel easy about a violent crime. Here was a respectable businessman, a justice of the peace, found dead in a cab in circumstances nobody could explain. The Daily Telegraph reached for the anxiety directly, writing that the knowledge that atrocious criminals had succeeded in evading detection for months on end was heavily fraught with mortification to the people of a civilized country. Confidence in the police was at a low ebb. The pressure on the Manchester Detective Office to resolve this quickly was considerable. The case was placed in the hands of Detective Chief Inspector Jerome Caminada. Caminada was 44 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation that was, by 1889, the most formidable in the city. He knew Manchester's criminal world the way a cartographer knows a coastline. Not just its landmarks, but its currents, its hidden channels, its patterns of movement. He had worked his way up from a beat constable in some of the worst streets in the city. He had made arrests that others thought impossible. He was not a theatrical man. He did not dramatise. He worked by accumulation, detail upon detail, witness upon witness, until the shape of a thing became clear. He began, as he always began, with the victim. There was no crime scene to examine. The cab was a thoroughfare, not a room. The body had been moved. The post-mortem had been inconclusive. The surgeons found no marks of violence on Fletcher's body, and the initial assessment was that he had died of alcohol poisoning. He was known to be a habitual gin drinker, and Dr. Ernest Septimus Reynolds, resident medical officer at the infirmary, who had assisted with the examination, described the deceased as a bull-necked man who had undoubtedly consumed a vast amount of ardent spirits. Fletcher's body parts had smelled strongly of alcohol. His liver was in the condition the surgeons called a gin drinker's liver, although they were careful to note that this was at an early stage and had not contributed directly to his death. It was, in short, entirely possible that John Fletcher had died of nothing more than drink. But Caminada noticed what was not there. Fletcher had left Southport that morning with a gold watch worth £120, a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles, a purse of gold sovereigns, and a cheque-book for the Southport branch of the Manchester and Salford Bank. When his body arrived at the infirmary, all of it was gone. There were only 2 spectacles cases and the cheque-book, the latter of no use to a thief, which was perhaps why it had been left, but everything of immediate value had vanished. Caminada's starting point was the assumption that mattered. A man had been robbed. Whether or not the robbery had become a murder was a question the evidence had not yet answered. He began walking. Caminada walked, in a sense, the same route that Fletcher had walked. He went to the cathedral. He found the 3 Arrows on Deansgate and spoke with the landlady. He found the cabman Henry Goulding and took his account of the evening. He found P.C. Jakeman and recorded his description of the young man. These details Caminada set beside the descriptions given by other witnesses who had seen Fletcher that afternoon and evening, building a composite from testimony in the way a draftsman builds a portrait from separate sketches. He traced the cab's route. He stood on Cambridge Street at the point where the passer-by had called up to Goulding, and he looked at the angles, which direction the young man had run, where he might have gone, which streets connected to which. He went to the lock-up on Stretford Road, which had been the cab's destination, and found it was a lock-up shop belonging to a tailor who had never heard of John Fletcher. The address had been false. The destination had never mattered. What mattered was the journey. Caminada found the passer-by who had alerted the cab driver. The man had been standing outside Lipton's shop as the cab passed. He'd seen a hand reach out from the cab window to open the carriage door from outside. He'd watched a young man drop from the step and run down the footpath towards All Saints' Church on Oxford Road. The direction of flight matched the direction away from the city and towards the residential streets of the south. Caminada took this and walked further. In the neighbourhood around High Chatham Street, he found a beer house called the York Minster, whose landlord, James Holden, described a young man who had come in alone that evening after the incident. The man had been wearing a dark brown check waistcoat and a valuable gold watch and chain. He'd ordered soda water and milk, a notably sober choice for a public house, and had asked for change, pulling out a handful of gold and silver coins as he did so. He mentioned to Holden that he was a stranger in town, up from London, and when he finished his drink, around 8:30, he went outside and hailed another cab. The relentless Caminada found that second cabman. His name was William Coleman. He had driven the young man from the York Minster to the Locomotive Inn on the other side of the cathedral. Coleman remembered the watch and chain, and the description matched the one belonging to John Fletcher. He also remembered that his passenger had been in an odd mood, restless at first, riding on the box beside Coleman rather than inside the carriage, even asking to take the reins. But after a while he had grown cold and climbed inside. The Locomotive Inn. Caminada knew it. It was a notable haunt of pugilists, men involved in the world of illegal prize fighting that ran alongside the legitimate sporting culture of Victorian Manchester like a shadow. The connection lodged itself in his mind. The first inquest opened on the 1st of March at the coroner's court. It was brief. The landlady of the Three Arrows confirmed what she had already told the police. The other witnesses had little to add. The deputy coroner adjourned the proceedings until the 4th of March to allow time for Charles Estcourt, the city analyst, to examine the contents of Fletcher's stomach. The Blackburn Standard reported that the investigation was not very promising and that the police had made very slight progress. Caminada read this and redoubled his efforts. What Caminada was doing, while the newspapers speculated and the inquest waited, was thinking through the chemistry. The post-mortem had detected chloral hydrate in Fletcher's stomach contents. Chloral hydrate was a sedative, a white crystalline solid, soluble in liquid, used medically for insomnia and anxiety. It was almost undetectable in a glass of beer, and crucially, while a dose of 20 grains was the smallest amount known to have caused a fatal poisoning, its lethality increased dramatically when combined with alcohol. A man who was already drinking, a habitual gin drinker slightly unsteady by 6 in the evening, would be far more vulnerable to a dose of chloral than a sober man. The drug was also used, Caminada knew, in the world of prize fighting. It was added to the water used by fighters seconds to rinse out the mouths of opponents before bouts, to dull their reactions and make them easier to beat. The Locomotive Inn, a haunt of pugilists. Chloral hydrate, a young man who moved with ease through the city's drinking establishments. Caminada thought about it, and then he went to his knowledge of the criminal fraternity. The encyclopedic, carefully maintained, never quite written down knowledge that was the essential resource of a Victorian detective, and he began to consider candidates. A young man, connection to the fighting world, familiar with the drug's uses. Charlie Parton came to mind. Charlie was 18 years old, or thereabouts. The precise figure would be established later. His father was John Parton, known around the trade as Pig Jack, a former iron dealer who now ran a beerhouse in Greengate, a run-down quarter of Salford just across the river from Manchester. The tavern was known. It was the kind of place where fighters gathered, where racecourse men congregated, where the lines between sport and crime blurred in the way they tended to do in establishments that stayed open late and asked few questions. Pig Jack was said to have drugged customers before, adding something to their drinks to make robbery easier. He had drugged the water used to wash out the mouths of fighters he had backed to give his man an advantage. His son had grown up in that world. Caminada compared the witness descriptions to Charlie. Young, fresh-faced, clean-shaven, small in stature, familiar with Manchester's public houses, confident in his movements. He made his decision with the directness that characterised him. The more I thought of the matter, he would later write, the more I felt convinced that I was on the right track, and at length I determined to arrest him. At midnight on the 2nd of March, 4 days after Fletcher's death, Caminada and his officers went to the address near the Locomotive Inn where the Parton family lived. They found Charlie Parton in his bed. He came quietly. The next morning several witnesses were brought in. P.C. Jakeman, Henry Goulding, William Coleman. Each of them looked at the young man standing in the identity parade, and each of them identified him. Parton, for his part, offered an alibi. He had been at a greyhound race in Liverpool on the day in question. He could not have been in Manchester. He had not been in the Three Arrows. He had never met John Fletcher. Caminada did not argue with him. He noted the alibi carefully, the claim that Parton had been in Liverpool, and he went to Liverpool. The Manchester Detective Office had, shortly before Fletcher's death, received a communication from colleagues in the Liverpool force about a young man wanted for the theft of a quantity of chloral hydrate from a chemist's shop. Caminada had noted it at the time and filed it away, and now he retrieved it, went to interview the chemist. Charles Bromley ran a small shop. He described what had happened on the 19th of February, a week before Fletcher's death. A young man had come in and asked to purchase 40 grains of chloral for his mother, who suffered from angina. Bromley had declined to dispense without a prescription. The young man had then asked for a smaller quantity, 10 grains, and Bromley had agreed and begun to weigh it out. As he was doing so, the customer leaned across the counter, snatched the bottle, which contained approximately a pound of the substance, and ran. The description of the thief matched Parton exactly. And Parton had claimed to have been in Liverpool around that time for a coursing meeting, which would, as Caminada noted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has found the piece that completes a puzzle, at once be an explanation for his possession of the poison. But the case was still not complete. The medical evidence remained inconclusive. Charles Escourt, the city analyst, had received 3 sealed jars from the deputy coroner, containing samples from Fletcher's stomach and intestines. He found traces of chloral hydrate in 2 of them. This was the first time in British legal history that a criminal prosecution for chloral hydrate poisoning had ever been attempted, and the chemistry was genuinely difficult. Chloral is soluble. It disperses quickly in liquid and in tissue. The amount present in the body was impossible to quantify precisely, and the experts disagreed about whether alcohol alone might have killed him. Dr. Julius Dreschfeld, Professor of Pathology, gave his opinion that death had been caused by the combined effect of alcohol and chloral. Others were less certain. Without a clear determination of cause of death, a murder conviction would be hard to obtain. Caminada filed what he had and continued. 2 more witnesses came forward as the case attracted newspaper attention, each adding weight to the picture he was building. The first was Samuel Oldfield, a grocer from Ancoats. On the evening of the 8th of January, Oldfield had been out drinking with friends in a beer house near the marketplace. At 10:30 the group had left the tavern and encountered a man near Victoria Station, who persuaded them to join him for one more drink at a nearby establishment. The following morning, Oldfield had woken in a police cell with no memory of the previous night. He'd assumed he'd been drunk, but when he discovered that his watch and his money were missing, he began to wonder whether he had been helped to that condition. Now, almost 2 months later, reading about the death of John Fletcher, he came to the detective office and identified Parson as the man who had invited them in for that final drink. The second witness was John Parkey, a railway porter from Ashton-under-Lyne. On the 28th of December 1888, Parkey had come into Manchester for a festive drink at the Wheatsheaf Hotel near Smithfield Market. At the end of the evening he and his friend had been walking towards London Road Railway Station, where they encountered Parson and his brother emerging from the White Bear in Piccadilly. Parkey's friend knew Parson's brother, and all 4 had gone into a nearby public house. The beer had flowed. Parson and Parkey had argued about boxing, or rather had begun to argue, because at some point Parson suggested the others step outside to settle something, and when they returned they found Parkey in a state of stupor, with Parson helping him into a cab. The next morning Parkey found himself without his watch or his money. He too came forward now, and he too identified Parson. A pattern. 3 men, 3 evenings. A drink in company, a descent into unconsciousness. A theft committed in the interval between the 2. The only difference was that John Fletcher had not woken up. When the case went before the magistrate, Mr. Headlam, at the City Police Court on the 8th of March, there was not an empty seat in the lower gallery. The standing room in the upper gallery was packed too, and those who had secured a place would need it. The hearing ran for 5.5 hours. At 11 o'clock, Charles Parton entered the dock. He sat down and looked out at the assembled crowd with something that witnesses described as calm. The charges were read: the murder of John Fletcher, the theft of his watch and chain, the administration of chloral hydrate to the victim for the purpose of robbery, and 2 counts of robbery in the earlier cases of Parkey and Oldfield. Parton listened and then, throughout the long morning, paid close attention to the proceedings, frequently consulting with his solicitor. The medical report was delivered to held breath. The experts agreed that Fletcher had died of syncope, a loss of consciousness from which he had not recovered. The key question was what had caused it. Fletcher's family history was raised. His uncle had suffered from heart disease, and John Robert Fletcher testified that his uncle had occasionally become intoxicated. The house surgeon's initial assessment, alcohol poisoning, was rehearsed. Against this, East Court confirmed his findings: chloral hydrate present in 2 of the 3 samples taken from the body. Dreschfeld maintained his opinion that death had resulted from the combined effect. Neither position could be proved beyond doubt with the science available to the court in 1889. Parton was remanded in custody while the case was built for trial. He was committed to the Liverpool Assizes, where the jurisdiction for wilful murder would fall, and the interval between that committal and the opening of the trial was the period in which Caminada played what he later called his final card. Through his network, the web of informants and contacts and half-willing acquaintances that was the real infrastructure of Victorian detective work, he learned that there had been another witness in the Three Arrows on the night of the 26th of February. Someone who had been present when Fletcher and Parton drank their bitter, who had seen something and said nothing. Caminada found him. His name was Edward Phillips. He was a bookkeeper employed by a firm in the city, a quiet, respectable man with no particular appetite for being involved in a murder trial. He'd watched the newspaper coverage and had kept his silence, telling himself that what he had presumed at the time was the administration of medicine was no business of his. Caminada persuaded him otherwise. Patiently, without coercion, he made clear to Phillips what his silence was costing, that a man was on trial for murder, that the case against him rested on circumstantial evidence, and that only a direct witness could settle it. Phillips agreed to give a statement, and what he described was this. On the evening of the 26th of February, in the Three Arrows on Deansgate, he had been in the company of the 2 men. He had watched the young man, Parton, reach into his pocket and produce a small vial. He had seen Parton pour the liquid from the vial into Fletcher's glass of beer. He had assumed it was medicine. He thought nothing more of it until he realised, weeks later, reading the coverage in the press, that he had been an eyewitness to a murder. St George's Hall in Liverpool stands on the plateau above Lime Street Station. Its classical columns and long stone facade, a declaration of civic seriousness the Victorians were very good at. On the morning of Monday the 18th of March, almost exactly 3 weeks after the death of John Fletcher, the murder trial of Charles Parton began there. The previous evening and early that morning, people had gathered on the steps of the Crown Court in such numbers that there was a real fear the doors would be pushed in. The press commented on the surprising proportion of ladies among the spectators. Parton entered the dock and entered his plea, not guilty. He said it quietly and sat down, and throughout the day that followed he maintained what the observers described as an air of calmness, the courtroom drama playing out before him while he watched with something close to composure. He was 18 years old. The case for the prosecution was built carefully, as Caminada had built it, one layer at a time, one witness at a time, the weight accumulating rather than arriving all at once. The two cabmen gave their accounts. P.C. Jakeman gave his. The landlord of the York Minster described the young man who had come in after the incident, wearing a gold watch and chain, asking for change, claiming to be a stranger from London. The grocer Oldfield and the porter Parkey described their own evenings with Parton, the drinks they had taken, and the mornings they had not remembered. When the question of medical evidence was reached, Charles Escourt confirmed that he had found chloral hydrate in the deceased's stomach and intestines. He was cross-examined carefully on the limits of his findings, on the solubility of the chemical, on the difficulty of quantifying the dose, on the range of outcomes that had been recorded in the medical literature. 20 grains had killed a man, 160 had been survived. The combination with alcohol was, he maintained, far more dangerous than either substance alone. His evidence was thorough, and it was honest about its own uncertainties. He did not claim more than the science could provide. Professor Dreschfeld followed with his conclusion: death by the combined effect of alcohol and chloral hydrate. Dr. Reynolds described his examination of the body and his observations about the condition of the liver. A gin drinker's liver, beginning to show the effects of a long habit, but not yet the cause of death. Neither man could state with absolute certainty that chloral had been administered deliberately, but both could state, without reservation, that Fletcher had chloral in his body, that he had been drinking heavily, and that the combination had killed him. The testimony of Edward Phillips was given from the witness box in St. George's Hall, with the careful precision of a man who had spent weeks rehearsing it in his mind, and who understood that he was now doing something that could not be undone. He described the evening. He described the two men. He described the moment, a hand into a pocket, a small vial produced, a tipping of liquid into a glass of beer. He described his assumption that it was medicine and his growing understanding, as the weeks passed and the newspaper coverage accumulated, that it had not been. He was cross-examined on why he'd not come forward sooner. He gave his answer plainly. He had been reluctant. He had not been certain of what he had seen. He was certain now. For the defence, the alibi was pressed, that Parson had been in Liverpool on the 26th of February at a coursing meeting and could not have been in Manchester. The witnesses who had identified him in the identity parade were challenged on the reliability of their recollections, on the lighting conditions of the evening, on the brief time they had spent in his company. The defence argued that the medical evidence was inconclusive, that John Fletcher had been a habitual drinker whose health was already compromised, and that the presence of chloral in his body could not be conclusively linked to anything Parson had or had not done. It was not an implausible defence, but it was undermined by the accumulation of the testimony. The cabbies, the constable, the bookkeeper, the grocer, porter, and by the details of the chloral stolen from Bromley's chemist in Liverpool, and by the fact that Parson's own claimed connection to Liverpool placed him near the scene of the theft at the relevant time. The Liverpool alibi, which might have saved him, instead helped confirm the chain. Just after noon on the second day, Mr. Justice Charles gave his summary to the jury. He was measured and methodical. He covered the evidence, the witnesses, the medical testimony, the chemistry, the alibi. He noted the weight to be given to each element. He did not lean. He gave them the case as it stood and sent them out to find their way through it. They were gone for 20 minutes. 20 minutes is not a long time to decide that a man's life should end. It is long enough, perhaps, to read through the main points once, to look around the room at each other, to ask whether anyone has a reservation, to conclude that there are none. When they filed back in, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict in a single word: guilty. And then, before sitting down, added the recommendation for mercy on account of the prisoner's youth. The ladies in the public gallery wept. Charles Parson gripped the rail of the dock. The judge put on his black cap. The death sentence was passed in the language that had been refined by repetition into something close to ritual. The words that judges had spoken in English courts for centuries. The formula that carried in it the full weight of a society's determination to answer violence with the most final violence it possessed. Parton received it without visible expression. The sentence was never carried out. In the weeks that followed, the people of Manchester, many of whom had followed every development in the case with the closest attention, began to feel something shift. The Lancaster Gazette published what it described as an account of a confession, apparently made by Parson while he was being held at Manchester Town Hall, given to an acquaintance of his father who had visited him in the cells. The prisoner was reported to have said, "I gave him more than I intended, and when we came out of the Three Arrows I saw he was a goner, so I put him in the cab and got away as soon as I could." The confession was never verified. It was never passed on to the police. Its provenance was uncertain, but it circulated, and in circulating it shaped the public mood in ways that are difficult to fully account for. Here was a young man who had not intended a death, who had miscalculated a dose, who had panicked and run. Whether any of that was true, no one could say. But the doubt was enough to prompt Parton's barrister to initiate a petition to the Home Secretary, seeking a commutation of the death penalty. The request was granted. Charles Parton's sentence was reduced to penal servitude for life. A year later, John Parkey, the railway porter from Ashton-under-Lyne, who had drunk with Parson on the 28th of December 1888 and woken without his watch or his money, died. He died of a lingering illness from which he had never fully recovered, an illness that those who knew him attributed to the night he could not remember. He had survived the encounter with Parton. He had not, in the end, escaped it. The Watch Committee of the Manchester City Police increased Caminada's annual salary from £200 to £250. The Manchester Courier wrote that great credit was due to the Chief Constable and to his excellent lieutenant, Chief Detective Inspector Caminada, for the thoroughness with which they had succeeded in unravelling what was, at that time, regarded as a serious outrage. The Daily Telegraph noted that the resolution of the Manchester cab mystery had gone some way towards restoring public confidence in the police, confidence that the Whitechapel murders had so badly damaged. Caminada himself was characteristically quiet about it. He'd done his work as he always did, by accumulation, by movement, by the patient reconstruction of the thing that had happened. He'd walked the route. He'd found the witnesses. He'd gone to Liverpool and stood in Charles Bromley's chemist's shop and understood what the bottle of stolen chloral meant. He'd found Edward Phillips and persuaded him to speak. He had taken 3 weeks to prove that a man who showed no marks of violence had been murdered. The cab moves through gaslit streets. It's late on a Tuesday evening in February, and the city sounds are beginning to thin. The market stalls closing, the last of the evening foot traffic making its way home, or towards a final drink. The horses' hooves ring on the stone. The near side door hangs open because the young man who reached through the door to open it has already gone, already running down the footpath towards All Saints' Church, already past Lipton's shop, already absorbed into the maze of streets that Victorian Manchester offered to anyone who needed to disappear. Inside the cab, a man sits with his head beginning to droop. When somebody tries to rouse him, he mutters, "Go away, leave me alone," as if sleep was simply coming for him in its ordinary way, as it always did, and as it would again. As if the evening had been unremarkable. The city carries on outside the cab windows, coal smoke and gaslight, the smell of the river when they pass near the Irwell, February dark, and a man in a hansom cab, and the ordinary-looking end of an ordinary-seeming day. John Fletcher was 50 years old. He'd packed a case for Knutsford that morning, made an appointment for dinner that he did not keep. He had 2 glasses of bitter in a pub, which he paid for, in the company of a young man he'd met somewhere in the city. He'd hailed the cab. He never reached the infirmary conscious. He never woke up. The cab moves, the city carries on. Somewhere behind it, a young man is running, and the night is taking him in. Thank you for listening to this episode of Manchester Murders. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, if you're enjoying the podcast, please do support us by leaving us a review and sharing with a friend. And until then, stay safe.